Hello and welcome to Cherry Red TV. I'm Iain McNay and my guest today is Jonathan Donahue from Mercury Rev, and we're going to talk about the band and about Jonathan's life, and I think it's going to be fascinating. You're going to enjoy it. So just to provide some context, he was in a band called the Flaming Lips. He did 2 albums with them, one of which is here, and then he's made I think 8 albums with Mercury Rev, is that right?
Yeah, maybe closer to 10.
So, Jonathan, let's start with the name. Well, where did the name come from in the first place? Unusual name, Mercury Rev.
Interdependent origination, meaning it just arose almost instantaneously and simultaneous from myself and Grasshopper. I think I had the Mercury, and from what I recall, he had the Rev.
Yeah.
And we collided the two together, and I don't know that we ever considered ever being asked the question again. What would it mean? And we've had 100 interpretations through the years. Mercury, the messenger; Rev, French dream, the messenger of the dream, is one of them. And I'm buying them all.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting name. And I think the other interesting thing to start with is that You've changed musically so much over the years. Well, I think you had Mercury Rev to start with, and then you went off originally as the guitar technician for Flaming Lips, and then you joined the Flaming Lips for 2 bands.
Yeah, that's right. Grasshopper, myself, Dave Baker, and Suzanne originally were messing around with the beginnings of Your Self-Esteem. We were doing some midnight recordings with Dave Fridman, who was still in college at the time, doing his senior project, and so we would get midnight time for free while he was fulfilling his senior project, which would become Your Self-Esteem. He would turn in our album in order to graduate. And so while that was happening, I had been working with Wayne and Michael and their original drummer Richard for a number of years before as not so much a guitar tech, because I didn't have that tech part down, but I really was a fantastic bubble machine operator and strobe light putter-upper and light a cigarette, pass it to the driver kind of comrade. There was only 4 of us in the van driving around in early Flaming Lip days. And so I was sort of that one person off to the side for a few years. They would just sort of manage the entire psychedelic experience, which it really was, even today, for people who think of Flaming Lips and they think of this giant sort of rainbow of colors and hallucinations. It was like that more than 30 years ago. It was just scaled, but at the same time that other bands were just bringing out Marshall stacks and Fender Twins and turning on a single light and just hammering it out. Wayne and Michael, myself and Richard were putting together these giant elaborate shows with smoke machines and rudimentary lasers. We'd even light off fireworks in our own small Def Leppard kind of pyrotechnic way back in the mid-'80s. So that had certainly already been there. The seed was already sprouted long before I think that the stage show for Flaming Lips has even gone to now.
And what was your relationship with Wayne Coyne like during this time? Because I think you moved to become second guitar in the band, didn't you?
We did. After their 3rd record, I probably in almost the younger brother role to Wayne, who's a few years older than me. I sort of had that young brother ambition, maybe without the experience to mediate it a bit. And so I was always coming up with almost unattainable recording goals. And Wayne in particular was always so open to saying, hey, Dingus, that was my nickname there, and he had a nickname, and we all had nicknames. He said, Dingus, why don't you just go ahead and do it yourself? And so we had an old Tascam Porta Studio cassette player, and we began overdubbing for really the first time in the Flaming Lips recording history, paying attention to multi-tracking in a way that on the first few albums, they were always in and out of the studio in like 10 days doing 12 songs. And I have always regarded myself as something of a studio creature. And I probably, looking back, was always silently, or maybe not so silently, encouraging that studio use of multi-tracking. And I was just talking to Wayne the other day, and we were recalling some of the first 4 tracks that we had done together. And it really was a case of, Dingus, why don't you go over there and lay something down? Why don't you do that, Dingus? I'll listen. Let me see what you're going to do. And so I was sort of that young gun, always willing to sort of pull the 6-shooter out of the holster, probably before anyone else, and just start firing away. And that was probably the beginnings of what I would consider, and I think even Wayne would consider, the sort of studio explorations of Flaming Lips, in the way that people have come to know them now, was from those early 4 tracks.
Right. And you did 2 albums with them.
Yes.
And then you had kind of a difference, did you, with Wayne? What's the reason you left?
No, I never had a difference. I don't recall there ever being a difference. What I can say is that, from my point of view, there became a wind at my back that seemed much greater than anything I could put my finger on. It was one of those life winds that just blow you in a different direction, even though your compass and your charts say you're going in this way. For some reason, the winds took me in another way, and it was very bewildering when it happened, because I loved the band. I loved being in the band. I felt at home in the band. I felt a real part of the music that we were making. But there was something behind me, that invisible arm pushing you out the door on the first day of school. And all you're doing is looking back and saying, I don't want to go. I don't want to leave home. This is what I love, being here. And there's a mother there behind you saying, this is a bigger part of life. And it took me a while to process that, you know.
But how did you feel the wind? How did you recognize it?
It was something inside of me that just all of a sudden just seemed to orient to a different pole star. I can't say there was one thing. There wasn't a blowout. We never had an argument.
So you kind of knew inside, even though it was
it felt
to be inconvenient.
It felt like I was moving even beyond a direction I might have seen, like being on an old Spanish galleon. You see the island you're familiar with, the port of call you've always known, and for whatever reason, the boat's not going that way, no matter how you change the masts, you know. And I do say that from my own point of reference, that I can't recall ever having an argument, ever, with Wayne or Michael. We might approach a musical idea somewhat differently from time to time, but we never argued. There was never any plate throwing, knife wielding, ever. It was really a joy, because that was one thing in very early Mercury Rev with Dave Fridman and with Wayne and Michael, the explorations in the studio. And I know it sounds so cliche, but it really was, at that time, very few American bands were ever producing themselves. They were just recording themselves. But we actually considered ourselves to be producing real records, even if they weren't considered online with popular records in the late 80s. I always felt that we were producing real records. We just didn't ever have a producer like so many British bands did, that we could lean on, a seasoned Steve Lillywhite or something. We were making it up as we went. And I know, because I was just talking with Wayne the other day for a long time on the phone about this, and we were laughing because we really considered ourselves these little George Martin Juniors, except we had no training in skills to write pieces and read or write music. None of us could.
So who was in the band originally, the original Mercury Rev?
The original Mercury Rev was 6 of us. It was myself and Grasshopper, Dave Baker, who did sort of half of the singing. I would sing half of them, and David would do the other. Dave Fridman was the bass player, Grasshopper's longtime childhood friend. Suzanne Thorpe was a flute player, and we had a drummer from Buffalo called Jimmy Chambers.
I read somewhere that David Baker was always confrontational. Is that right?
I wouldn't say that. He was and still is a very sensitive soul. He has a spectrum like a radio in your car that goes beyond the dial on each side. And it keeps going beyond the right and left of how far it usually goes for most people. And so he was ultra sensitive to emotional frequencies in other people that most of us, we don't feel.
So he was picking things up that you weren't necessarily aware of at the time.
Yes, not only from within the band, from outside the group as well. And at the beginning with Mercury Rev, when we released Your Self-Esteem, it actually had a real great groundswell of critical praise, something we never thought we'd ever get to England. We never thought it was even going to come out. It came out on a tiny punk label. But it was David Baker who really helped us navigate the press. We'd never done interviews before. Even while I was in Flaming Lips, we hadn't done that style of NME, Sound, Select, Vox, Melody Maker, just real British old school journalism. And David was really the one who helped us understand what actually was happening, because I don't know that Grasshopper and myself had any inkling of what was really happening to the group in '91.
And the interesting thing was, right throughout your career, Mercury Rev career, you've always been on British independent labels.
And you can absolutely trace the first initial recordings on British independent labels to David Baker. It was David who made all the introductions. He met Martin, he met Jeff, he met just about everybody. He was that face of the band. Now, if we mix that with someone very ultra emotionally sensitive to frequencies in a room, at times, yes, I'm sure it was perceived as more than eccentric, but it was David who would say, this is a really great label. We ought to look at this. And believe me, after Your Self-Esteem came out, we had a lot of choices. It doesn't seem like that looking back now, but at the time, we had a lot of choices. And it was always David who seemed to have a great knowledge of the way the British machine worked. And, recall that in the late 80s, there was no US machine. There was college radio, but there was no great machinery for independent records in a large-scale way. There were wonderful little labels, SST, Homestead, Restless, and a few others, but it didn't have the coordination with the press that the British industry did.
Yeah, and we had the advantage because obviously it's smaller geographically, smaller population, so all the magazines are national, there's national radio.
And you had punk.
Well, we had punk.
Americans had hardcore, but we hadn't yet had the independent post-punk sound that could sort of be formed. So really in America in the mid-'80s, it was the hardcore bands that paved the way for other groups like Sonic Youth or Dinosaur or Flaming Lips to do all our little touring in America. We were really following where the hardcore bands played, the little social clubs, but in America we call them Elks Clubs, and sort of workmen's sort of union halls and places where, Black Flag would play.
Even though your music was so different from
Absolutely, but that was the only way we knew to navigate a giant country, was to follow where Minor Threat would have played, Black Flag would have played.
Yeah. So you did 2 albums with David Baker singing.
Yes.
And then he left.
He did. And there was a parting of ways. It was very mutual. There was no giant row. There was no one incident. But I think it had to do with David was looking for a different musical fireplace to sort of sit beside. And I think for myself and Grasshopper, we were actually enamored with a more melodic side to music at that time. And maybe that is something you might hear the difference, the leap from Bosie's into See You on the Other Side, was there's an immediate embrace of melody, and we call it the old-timey sound of America, some of that almost Broadway, Jerome Kern, 1940s style music on a few of the songs. And I don't know that, I think David himself would agree that there were elements of that he wanted to explore in different ways with us. And songwriting would have been one of them. Up to that point, I had been doing a lot of the music, and David would add some of the lyrics on top. And I fully believe he found it frustrating to work like that and wanted to do some music where he created the musical bed and then could do his own lyrics, you know.
It seemed the first two albums that it was more chaotic, the sound. Obviously, strong psychedelic influence. And then when he left, as you say, you became more melodic. Songs seemed to be more structured and more, you can't use the word poppy, but certainly more listenable.
The first two albums, we were orchestrating. We simply didn't have the lexicon of vocabulary to do it with the traditional instruments. And so we would layer maybe 40, 50 tracks into a song of feedback and little parts. And as a small aside, this is really where Dave Fridman cut his teeth as an engineer, let alone producer, was managing not only 6 people in Mercury Rev, each wanting to record 4 or 5 tracks of their own, but also in Flaming Lips, there were multi tracks. I mean, Wayne and I were talking about a song we did in Flaming Lips on the Pink album, the Priest-Driven Ambulance, called Unconsciously Screaming. And he was remarking to me the other day that it was the most mixed song he thought Flaming Lips had ever done. I think he said it had above 100 mixes of it. And it wasn't because we were getting it wrong. It's just we didn't quite get it right. We had such an imagination to how things should be, and we didn't yet all have the skills or the ears, the mature ears, to know when we just had it right. And so we were really dialing in things that maybe most people wouldn't hear on some early Rev records or early Flaming Lips, but for us, they were meticulously done.
And did you feel in the end you got it right?
I try not to think about that. I try not to go back in that way. I know from my own point of view, I can speak for Wayne, I could speak for Dave Fridman, Dave Baker, anyone you want. We did it the best we could.
Yeah.
In both bands, we never left the studio with less than we thought. We might have almost broken each other's backs in trying to get to something we all felt was it. But I never left the studio once in either band feeling, oh, we missed it and who cares and no one will notice. That was never the case in either band.
So, See You on the Other Side was your third album. David Baker had left, yes. So the vocals were now your vocals. The lyrics were your lyrics, the music.
In the entirety, yeah. Yes, some of the early ones, it was half 50-50.
Yeah, that's right. So it was a different style, as we've already touched on, and yet you were hugely disappointed in the end because the sales didn't seem to be there.
We had put everything we had into it. I mean, it really was a childlike record in that it was a children's record. It was conjuring up all these images Grasshopper and myself had from childhood of these melodies and these sort of half-forgotten songs from radio stations used to have radio shows in America, and there was one special one called the Make Believe Ballroom, and it would play all these 40 songs, and that's all I grew up listening to was this and Peter and the Wolf. And so we were bringing back all these sort of scratchy Polaroids into music. Again, I can listen back and I realize we didn't quite have the full skill set to meet all the ideas that I know we had, but we put everything into it. And we really thought, I mean, you can go and the listeners today or the viewers can listen to a song like Everlasting Arm. And you can say, oh, that's interesting for the time of 95. I thought it was a top 10 single. I was that out of focus of what was happening in alternative music at the time. There's no drums.
But maybe everybody else was out of focus.
I don't know, you know. I mean, you were in the business at the time, but I went into Columbia Records holding it, saying, this is a top 10 single. Now, in hindsight, there's no way it was ever going to be a top 1,000 single.
Yeah.
But that's the amount of myself and Grasshopper had put into that record. Suzanne as well, and Dave Fridman as well. And so when it came out, I don't think we ever thought it was going to go gold. We didn't have any illusions of that, but I think we thought it would be recognized as just something different from 1995's other landscape. We felt it was this little rainbow in a very flat-lined, beach-like horizon, but no one else did. And
that's pretty devastating as a musician, isn't it? When you put everything into it and you totally believe in it, and then responses.
Any walk of life, there's something somewhere in everyone's life they put themselves into so wholly that there's almost no distinction between the product and the person.
Yes.
And so it's almost a very visceral rejection, walking into your own birthday party and people shrugging, you know. And it just had that bottom of the sea feeling. It was just dark and
because they're rejecting you, aren't they?
We felt that way.
So totally into it.
Absolutely.
It's so totally your expression.
Yes.
So failure.
There was very little distance. And so, you know, especially me singing, doing the lyrics and much of the music, yeah, I took it incredibly personally, you know. I was that young and fawn-like in my understanding of the way that music and art works, that my little wobbly legs just couldn't stand the sort of the wind that rushed, and I tipped over.
So when you say you tipped over, what form did that take, the tipping over?
It took a number of cliches, you know, the alcohol and the substances. But these were just incidental to really what was being crushed inside. Those weren't the reasons for the dive down to the bottom at all. It was self-doubt. It was that self-loathing, you know, where I just didn't want to.
Self-loathing, wow.
Well, how you're young. Yeah. This is you. This is my music.
Yeah.
This is Grasshopper's music. It's Dave Fridman's music. Here it is.
Yeah.
And people just stared back at the time for their own musical reasons at the time. There was a lot going on in Britpop, certainly. And I didn't like the sound of my own voice. I wanted to get away from it, you know. And to say I look back and say, oh, I didn't handle it well, I should have been stronger. No, I was still quite young at the time. Mm-hmm. You know, I had to go through that melting down completely, back to the molten state, you know.
And then, but you had a side project, Harmony Rockets. And I remember you had I don't have a copy of it, but you had I think it was a 40-minute piece you did.
We did.
Yeah.
And it wasn't an escaping world for us. That was almost another dimension of Mercury Rev. But it's something we threw ourselves into. It's a 40-piece, almost mantra-like sonic sound of very reminiscent of people that we sort of were heavily influenced by in our later teenage years, like Tony Conrad, Pauline Oliveros, Terry Riley.
He was very minimal what he did, Tony Conrad.
Yeah.
I don't know much about him, but
he did a lot of the drone music with Lamont Young and John Cale. Then they would go on to form the Velvet Underground, and Tony was the one who gave the Velvet Underground its name.
Right.
And so he was an avant-garde filmmaker, very influential in New York in the early mid-'60s, created the strobe light effect with his film called Flicker. Was a big part of sort of that whole movement of subculture in the 60s surrounding Andy Warhol, but Tony himself wasn't that involved with it. But that minimal other sound, that other part of him.
John Cage, he was also involved. Well,
yes.
John Cage. Yeah.
Just about everybody in that period of time, Tony was working with. And so we studied with him for a bit in college. Grasshopper and Suzanne and David Baker especially studied under him for a long time. And that minimal style of music, that hypnotic, mesmerizing music. And for a time I was studying with a beat poet named Robert Creeley.
Okay.
Famous in the American canon of beat poets along with Kerouac, who had a very minimal style of writing, very almost Delta blues. Try to say it in as few words as possible. That's the trick. And that was something that stuck with me as I began to write much deeper from the inside out on See You on the Other Side. And so those were a lot of the influences that really came to the surface during See You on the Other Side.
And I think Grasshopper had his own solo project at this time as well, didn't he, too? So you were kind of expressing in your own way, I guess, helping the frustration to come out in a form, a musical form. Yeah,
Grasshopper had the Golden Crickets, I think it was
that's
called.
Right, yes. Which was, I think Beggar's Group also released, didn't they?
Yeah, and, again, it was something where for a while there was so limited talk between us. It was almost like astronauts on the moon in these crackly little bursts of, where are you? Dead silence. When you coming back? Dead silence. And there was just this, it wasn't even silence in a meditative way. It had no contemplation to it. It was just like the vacuum itself. It wasn't even self-reflective. There was no information. It was just empty.
And then Deserter Songs was born.
Out of that void.
Out of the void.
Out of the void. It wasn't planned. It wasn't premeditated. I didn't have it in my back pocket. Dave Fridman didn't have it up its sleeve. It arose of its own accord, of its own interest. I'd like to take more credit for it as always knowing it was there in me, but I can't. I didn't know it was in me. I didn't know it was in me when we recorded it. I didn't know it would ever be anything but a little fancy cassette for friends when we were done. That's just what Grasshopper and myself and Dave Fridman would speak of when we were recording it. We didn't have a real label until the very end for it, and so we never thought it was going to come out. And if you were to look at the 2-inch tapes, some of which have been washed away in a flood through the Catskills years later, they never said Mercury Rev on it. They said Harmony Rockets. All the songs, Holes, Endlessly, were all done on the engineers have track sheets with all the different numbers and tracks of what holds what. It always said Harmony Rockets.
Did the songs come together easily?
No, they took a while to reveal themselves, and I can't explain why. I'm glad they did, but I think in this case the songs were stronger than our own perceptions, thank God. That they waited to reveal themselves orchestrally, without drums, or whatever it is that might be charming to someone about Deserter Songs. At the time, it just seemed very forlorn. I don't recall many of those sessions leaving and saying, we've got it. Oh, this is the one. Wait till people hear this. We didn't think it was anything at all until the promotional copies had come out in late summer of '98. And Grasshopper and myself had come over here to do just a few interviews for it. And we were backstage at the Reading Festival in '98, and all of a sudden, journalist after journalist, friend after friend came up and said, my God, we heard the promo tape. It's fantastic. And we'd look at each other, and I really thought they were talking about someone else. Like maybe they had mistaken me for Pavement or something. And they said, no, Deserter Songs. And we looked at each other, and we said, you sure? And we're like, yeah. And that was the first real inkling we had that something bigger had happened that we had no knowledge of at the time.
But you see, I think the emotion that you felt came out in those songs. And as an example, I was playing some of your albums the other day, and my wife was listening, and I put on Deserter songs, and she starts crying. And I said, "Why are you crying?" She said, "I just feel such sadness." And it was Holes, the first track. "I feel such sadness in this song." And it's like she picked up. I don't know whether you were sad when you wrote it, but she picked something up.
No, we still get
such a depth there.
We still, people come up after every show and say they were crying during the show 20 years later, And that was the beauty of magnetic tape. I'm not surprised. There was a lot of sadness. There was a lot of isolation. There was a lot of lost in one record.
You also had Gareth Hudson and Levon Helm from the band who were helping you with that. They had some input.
We did, living in the Catskills, they were our neighbors. Garth, Levon, and Rick all lived very close. You'd see them out at the stores and things like that. And so we had asked them. They all said yes. At the time, Rick was over in Japan, so he couldn't record with us, but Garth and Levon did. And, to be fair, at that time, I think they were in dark days as well.
Yes.
This was prior to Levon Helm's studio being sort of having a renaissance with the Rambles and a reimagining of band songs. This was somewhat very parallel to that lost feel that we had. I wouldn't speak for them, but that's the sense I had too, that for their own reasons, we came together for that period. And we just played with Garth a few months ago and saw him again. I don't think, looking back, they realized any import to the music that they were recording for us. I don't think they walked away thinking it would be this band from the Catskills big record themselves, But it was more than serendipitous. It was even more than synchronous. It was almost codependent origination, where we couldn't have done it without them. And even with that, it brought them some renewed, the band, they're still playing, there's still members up there living and working. And not too long after that, Levon started his Midnight Rambles with Larry Campbell and other people with huge success.
Yeah. So how did that affect you personally, that success? Here you were, down in the dumps, Deserter Song was going to maybe be a cassette for a few friends, and that was it. This big success, I think it was a top 20 album, acclaim.
Yeah.
I think you got some awards, didn't you, for it?
Yeah, it was Album of the Year in many of the papers, and across the world it was really like Album of the Year. I probably would have went off the deep end, but See You on the Other Side, it was that record that saved me, because I'd already been down there.
Yeah.
I'd already found that sort of footing on the bottom of the ocean floor to balance myself. And I feel that way about Grasshopper too, that because we had seen that low, Deserter Songs was a high, but it wasn't something that was going to knock us off. Because
it hadn't come easily, had it?
No, it had been reversed in order. Yeah, we'd probably be dead.
Yeah. Yeah. These things that come too easily, that's so easy to fall off the rails.
And that was something that I was very grateful for during Deserters, is we always had in the back of the consciousness, there was always this pulse to stay balanced. If you're going to believe the good reviews, then you have to believe the bad ones.
Interesting, I was reading the influence of Deserter Songs. Bands like Grandaddy, Radiohead, Doves, Coldplay. There's obviously to some degree they were influenced by that album. And that's quite a thing now, isn't it, to have had participation in the influence of those bands. Really, really big bands.
It's very groundbreaking when you realize that you're one long oral tradition. It's easy to stop and say, okay, this happened, and then I could see something else was born for it. But when you just see it as one long sprouting plant, bush, tree, whatever you want to look at it, it put it in perspective, and that's the way I see that kind of stuff now. Is the moment I hear someone mention other groups, I can think of all the Pauline Oliverises that influenced me. I can see it for myself. I can feel it go through me like a vine and just keep going. And that was really rewarding to me, because when you're young, you want to think that the buck stops here. It starts with me, it began with me, just me, not even him. And look at me, I'm the beginning, I'm the acorn. And with a little bit of patience and a hell of a lot of challenging experiences, you realize there is no acorn. It's just one long sprout.
Yeah.
That's at least the simple truth that appeared to me.
Yeah, the ups and downs are always there, and you ride the highs. And
it's one long musical ripple, and we're simply a little node on that wave.
Yeah, you can't take little parts and say that's it.
No, right. You can't divide it. It's indivisible. There is no number to it. There's no integer. There's no fraction to music. It's one complete thought.
Well, you're saying a lot of very deep things. Music is one.
I probably had some strong coffee.
What was the last one again? What is one last?
It's one complete thought.
One complete thought, yeah.
And for every artist, that's when you'll find their eyes light up about an album. To them, it's a complete thought. 10 sentences strung together as a whole complete thought. If you're fortunate, you'll have a few songs in your entire canon that you'll consider to be a complete thought. If you're more than fortunate, if you're divinely chosen, you might have one album that's a complete thought to you. The rest are fragmented. It's hard to have that entirely wholesome sphere. There's always some break in the surface of it somewhere for most of us the entire life. But every once in a while, there's someone somewhere that has the complete sphere, like the cosmos. It's infinite, but it's boundless, But it doesn't happen in any way I wish you could calculate, or you could buy some fancy guitar pedal and step on, and there it is. It doesn't work like that, as much as your youth would wish it were so.
Yeah, it seems like looking back on and forward to some extent with the albums you made, you started with not so much a degree of control, but you started with wanting to do something in particular, and the more your career is going on, there's an allowingness to see what comes through, and in a way there's more of you in it because there's more of you emotionally, but in another way there's less of you in it because you're not directing it so much.
This is life, as at least according to little Jonathan. We begin on the attack in our lives, whether you're in art or not. You begin to attack life when you're young and in your adolescence, that teenage angst. I'm going at life, saber drawn. And somewhere, if you are open to it and Providence intercedes, it can turn into a neutral point where you're neither attacking nor retreating. You are holding your ground. And then if you are gloriously lucky, it seems that it occurs not to you, but in you, to surrender. And that goes for life, but especially for the arts and music. You realize how much of a faucet you are, not the water itself.
Yeah.
That's the liberating moment in art for any artist. And that's when you can, that illumination follows the footsteps of the detachment from wanting a result from your art. And it doesn't come easy. It's not an instinctual move on anyone's part. It's something you have to buy that moment of pause, that moment of patience, and probably ultimately some great trust in something much bigger than yourself.
You realize you're a vehicle for the absolute.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the vehicle, that's the part that ultimately separated me from so many of the chicanes and obstacles that I seem to willingly pull in my way, like filling a living room with too much furniture.
Yeah.
You know, was wanting a result from the music.
All Is Dream was the next album.
Yeah.
There you are, coming off the back of a big album, all this acclaim. Did you feel pressure? How did you feel when you went?
No, I don't think we felt pressure. That would only have come if we knew what we did on Deserted Songs.
Good, yeah.
But we didn't. The strange part of All Is Dream really wasn't the recordings. It was the day it was released, 9/11.
Wow, I didn't pick that up. Wow.
So All Is Dream was released on 9/11, and everyone can remember where they were. The towers are falling. All is dream. I didn't have words, you know. I remember, I think I got the phone call from Grasshopper, look on TV that morning. And we lived in the Catskills, which was the flight path for those planes right down the Hudson River. Clear morning, blue sky, and he said, look on TV. And then we were watching, and I was watching, and then I think I got a second call from Grasshopper. He said, oh my God, you know what? And I said, no, what? Our record came out today.
Mm.
And it was never spoken of again. There was no way for the album to ever come back from that moment, that day. And so it almost had a voidness. It was almost like we had worked hard for 2 or 3 years on All This Dream, and it was just erased by something so much greater than itself. You know, there was no way to come back 3 months later and start waving it around and say, hey, this came out, people remember this. As everyone here in the room and in the world remembers, everything was erased that day. It was like a giant magnet came and just wiped clean what had come before in many respects. And with that album, it became inseparable to our little world with that day, you know. And the music had nothing to do with it. It was recorded well before it, but it certainly had that thread that it just, we still don't talk about it much to this day.
Although it was still your highest charting album in the UK, got to number 11 in the album chart, so
yeah,
it wasn't ignored in terms of...
No, not in that way, but it didn't... There was so much going on in everyone's consciousness those months that it couldn't process in a way that even Deserters had.
Yeah.
You know, and we weren't the only album released that day, of course. There was many others. But it was, at that time, inseparable. Those months after, as everyone can recall, the year after, the 2 years after, was just something wholly different than anything else, you know.
Yeah. There's a quote that you gave in another interview that I wrote down I really liked, which just kind of sums up what you're talking about. Once you release a record, it's no longer yours. And I guess in this situation too, because what happened was so overpowering in terms of 9/11, it was no longer yours. It's just out there, and then the universe does what it wants with it.
had I had a little bit greater insight at the time, I might have continued on the quote to say, what gives you the impression it was ever yours? Which was Deserter Songs.
Yeah.
It was never ours. It was something that was working through us for its own intent.
Yes. Okay, I wanted to also, we'll talk briefly about Secret Migration, which we were also still on the V2 label, British label.
I really loved that record. We went in a direction which was a much more concise approach to music. In a way, Mercury Rev has gone in the opposite direction of many bands who make 9 pop songs, and the 10th song is this expanded freak-out version that they end their albums with. Yeah. Well, for Mercury Rev, pop was the experimental part that we were dipping our feet in. Mm. And when Secret Migration came out, I felt it didn't quite resonate with people that way. I think people were much more connected to an expansive musical element in Mercury Rev than even I had thought, you know. And so the 3-minute songs seemed to almost a bit abrasive to many people, when for us it was a 3-minute song. It was something we really only dabbled in some arcane way. But when it came out, it really seemed, it didn't find a home in many people's arms. Some people it did. I still feel to this day there's some very strong songs on there, but you'd probably be a little hard-pressed to find a number of people who felt that way.
Yeah, top 20 album, still number 16. So again, it was it was popular enough at the time. And then you had Snowflake Midnight, which I really like. Yeah. I was playing that in the car on the way here this morning, which wasn't commercially successful. No. But I thought it was a lovely album.
I love it. It's probably one of my favorites. Mm. You know, it was one of those sort of crucible cauldron of all the elements of Mercury Rev that I really enjoy. You know, the song structures were really not very pop oriented. They weren't hooky. They didn't have these anthemic feels to them. But even when we play them live these days, it's the ones I really do look forward to in the set.
I find the songs there, some of them are unpredictable. They start a certain way, and there's a movement, and I'm not a musician, so I can't describe what happened musically, but there's a change in the feel of the song, and it's unpredictable. Yeah,
that's one of the many things I'm enamored with that album in particular. There was a case where I just felt we had really had a near complete thought. I won't say it was complete, but the circle was quite closed on that.
And then the last album you've released, you changed labels. It was on Simon Raymond's Bella Union label, The Light in You. I think there was quite a time, wasn't there? There was 7 years between Snowflake Midnight and The Light in You. So were you working more on Harmony Rockets in that time, or how were you spending your time there?
Time goes slowly in the mountains.
Actually, I'm thinking you did do a reissue of Deserter Songs with an instrumental version as well.
We toured a bit on Deserter Songs, but if there's one thing that probably frustrates band members through the years is that I seem to go slow. And I can understand that point of view that, you know, many bands do an album every 18 months or even quicker. But time just goes very differently in me. And so 7 years to me, it's just a blink of an eye. And I don't say that casually or carelessly, because I realize that entire bands had their career in that 7 years. There might have even been a genre or two that came and went.
Often 7 months these days.
Yes. And I understand the frustration sometimes around me, but I want to get it right. And to get it right, I have to be right on the inside. And for me to be right on the inside, I have to surrender. And sometimes there's little parts of you that are a little more unwilling to surrender than others, and it takes a little longer to really be that open faucet. I wish I could change that in me. I have lots and lots of songs, but they're not all ready. They're not all speaking to me clearly. And sometimes my ears are just filled with a lot of other stuff and I'm not hearing them, And I understand it from the other's point of view in the band that, hey, come on, it's time. We could do this again. Let's go on the road. But it's probably one of the things I wish I could manipulate to some greater degree, but I haven't yet.
On the other hand, we've just almost covered that in what we were talking about earlier. It's you're the vehicle, and then it's almost like the universe, the absolute, whatever you call it. It's his fault, her fault, isn't it? It's not your fault.
I wish I was a quicker vehicle.
Yeah. So, The Light in You is a beautiful album.
Yeah. I feel it was really good we did that. It was rewarding for the 7 years. I wouldn't have wanted to release something less than.
Yeah.
Not for the 7 years, but to know that something but inside of me had been worth the wait. For me, let alone people out
yes.
in hyperspace of music.
Yeah. Being worth the wait is important.
Yeah, making sure that you are worth the wait. Have you evolved in some meaningful way that adds something to this crazy world? And music itself isn't what adds anything to the world. It's people, And I think that often gets lost, that to me, a lot of people will say, oh, I heard your record and it changed my life. And I don't agree with that. I think people's lives are changing. And so the music that they're open to then changes. It's just that we can't ascribe the delay in time to anything but that. But I don't think music changes people's lives. I think people's lives are changing, and the music changes with them. It's just we don't notice the little delay in that. So we ascribe it to the music instead of saying, oh, I was changing.
And they recognize the change more because they realize, I like this music and I used to like that music.
Yes.
It gives them a reference point.
People say, oh, I'm a lot more cultured now. I listen to opera.
Yeah.
When that's not the case. It's that there's something in them has altered its center of gravity. And therefore what comes into focus and what is left to the peripheral is different from what they've known. And so they assume that it's the outside changing them. But I don't think that's the case. I don't feel that's the case. I haven't experienced that's the case. I experience that it's on the inside that the change occurs. Yeah. And then the outside colors in.
Well, we should let the viewers into a little secret that we're going to do another interview to follow this, which will talk a lot more about this subject, the inside and the outside changing and unconscious TV. But I just like to finish this interview with you talking briefly about your latest project, which is released, I think, February 2019. Just tell us what it is and how it came about, how you feel about it.
Well, it's a revisiting of Bobbie Gentry's album, The Delta Suite, which, to many people's understanding, was one of the first country music records that was a concept or had an embedded theatrical arc to it, where much of country music at the time didn't in 1968. And it was a record that followed up on the heels of Bobbie's biggest hit, Ode to Billy Joe, yes. Which in America, for all of us, FM radio hadn't kicked in yet with all the album-oriented deep cuts of Pink Floyd and long songs. And so all we had was the tinny little AM stations. And Ode to Billy Joe really imprinted on many of us growing up in that late 60s, early 70s time, almost like a ping pong ball on a baby duckling. You just looked at it, he said, this is different. Maybe this is my mother. Where there was all these other novelty songs at the time, Yummy, 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 I Got Love in My Tummy, and all this psychedelic soot and ash of, crazy raga rock and stuff. There was Ode to Billy Joe, which had this intense mystique to it. Even if you were young, you knew there was this giant unresolved question. What are these two people throwing off the bridge? And you could be too young to understand what it might have been. But you knew it was different, that there was a depth in this song. And I hear it over and over now that the album is sort of coming out and people come up to me and say, whoa. They say, it's Ode to Billy Joe. And I say, yes. And they say, it's the mystery. And I say, yes. And even that mystery, I don't know that it was in another pop song until Terry Jack's Seasons in the Sun, where he started singing about dying.
He was dying of cancer. That was
but
it,
you're
yeah.
too young. I couldn't
Yeah.
grasp that was it. I just knew, why is this man dying? And why is it on a 3-minute pop song? And why am I humming along to it and crying?
Yes.
And that was the beginning of the love of America with Bobbie Gentry, was this unresolved mystery that's continued for 50 years. Now her record, The Delta Suite, didn't have Ode to Billy Joe on it, but it had all of these other deeply emotional stamps of Bobbie and maybe her emotional childhood impressions of the Delta, which in itself was almost taboo at the time, to still be talking about the Delta in a way that didn't reference necessarily just the harsh emotional realities of its past, but also really spoke of it emotionally in a beautiful, heartfelt, pastoral way. Now, of course, 3 males from the Catskill Mountains, we don't have the Delta, but we have the mountains. So that was the part we could bring to it. We didn't want to treat the Delta Suite like it was the wreck of the Delta Suite, that we were diving down and pulling off parts of some old barnacled hull. It's still very alive. Yeah. But if we could hold up that Mercury Rev lantern to it, just hold up the lantern with our own musical Technicolor brushstrokes, that was enough.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. I really enjoyed chatting with you. It was really interesting. So thank you again, and thank you for watching Cherry Red TV. I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.